Okay, here we're going to go over some more evidence for evolution and talk about a little bit about some of the key evidence during Darwin and Wallace's time. Right, so evolution is genetic change in a population of organisms. It's progressive. It's the also kind of describes the history of organisms from simple to complex. And the main mechanism, we think, is called natural selection, the differential reproduction of genotypes caused by factors in the environment. Who's going to leave more offspring? Okay. So, we talked before about artificial selection, fossils, homology, and development. I'll just kind of review that again. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the rest of it. I'm going to talk about molecular record, island biogeography, or just biogeography, and a little bit about natural experiments and convergent evolution. Okay, in the fossil record, really this is fossils provide us a record of the course of life through time, from the origin, where we see the first fossils of prokaryotes, those are bacteria, and also shows kind of changes in the diversity of life. And as we get to fossils that are younger and younger and increasing similarity. So this is one of the key points of the fossil record. Another thing we talked about was anatomy and the similarities we see in different organisms. And these can really be followed during development. We see the formation of structures in embryos, and all embryos are very similar in that they're like when we talk about animals, they all start out as one cell that starts going through divisions and forming structures. And often the young embryos are all similar, but then they develop structures that will have different fates. Like in the case of this embryo here, there are these ridges or gill pouches that develop, pharyngeal pouches, and they develop into gills in fish, and in humans, these form the jaw and other structures. So just another example. And so here's a picture of a human embryo. Okay. All right, so now that takes us to the molecular record. And of course, none of this was known by Darwin, but it's turned out to be some of the strongest evidence for evolution in that we know how evolution occurs and the molecular changes that happen to DNA to cause changes in proteins in the amino acid sequence. And we can measure these changes by looking at similar molecules in different organisms. A molecule like hemoglobin is found in all vertebrates. And so we can see how similar it is by how many changes. And it has lots of different amino acids, and we can just measure these changes. And we can map them out. And so here there's a little map of how similar hemoglobin is. And we find that genes have similarities to other genes. They probably arise through duplications. And so that similarity in the protein is due to similarity in the DNA. And the number of changes tell us how long two organisms have been separate. Okay, and so this allows us to construct molecular clocks that show how many changes occur. And so like here, this is again looking at hemoglobin, and humans and other primates have very similar hemoglobins with only as few as 8 differences on one of the polypeptides, and one of the peptides will have about a quarter of all the number of proteins, so somewhere like 125. And so you can see these differences. Okay, and so and there's sometimes even differences within species, and so variation is one of the key themes of evolution, and variation is good. And so this all was important for Darwin and Wallace because the variation they could see in physical type and phenotype was really a problem for science of the day. And so scientists in the day were thinking that all species were created at one time, and that species were all the same. And really that was one of the problems with the existing ideas, was that this misconception, which came partly from the Bible and partly from Aristotle, a Greek philosopher. And Wallace in particular was focused on variation. he was collecting, he was a species collector and selling them to museums and private collectors. And so he was trying to match original type specimens. So the only collected individual of this butterfly species. And what he found was there was all this variation. And that was really a problem for him because it didn't match the specimen that was in the museum in London. And so it would be slightly different and he would get less money. And in particular, they began to notice that there were lots of unusual patterns in how species occurred on islands, and these made them question ideas they had about variation and how species came about. And so we refer to this as biogeography. It's the study of what organisms live where and why. And the particular pattern for both Darwin and Wallace that was a problem had to do with islands. Islands generally have few species, and the farther from the mainland they are, the fewer species they have. But what's unusual is they have many endemic species, which are found nowhere else. Endemic means belonging to this place. And then they had unusual species that had characteristics that seemed hard to explain. But it was clear that species that were on islands resembled the nearest mainland in some ways. But often one of these kind of unusual factors were that many islands had lots and lots of bird species that were flightless. And so Darwin and Wallace both began to realize that, well, birds reach islands at high rate because they can fly. And once they get to the island, flying isn't so great. There's nowhere else to go. They can just walk around because there's no predators. And so their wings become vestigial. And so there's many, many unusual flightless birds, particularly in Pacific islands. Okay, and so this led them to think species must change. New species develop over time. And right after Wallace and Darwin released their ideas, a great example came to them. And that was kind of a natural experiment that we now know of as industrial melanism, was the peppered moth. And this has two color variants, a dark or melanistic form and a white form. And it turns out the dark form has caused by a dominant allele that has lots of pigment. And this form, although the gene was dominant, this form was extremely rare into the 1850s. But then its frequency increased as the use of coal in England increased associated with the Industrial Revolution until it became the dominant form. Biologists have tracked this ever since, and when the Clean Air Act of 1963 was enacted in Britain, the amount of pollution dropped dramatically, and the wild type organism became much more common again. So this is an example of how when the environment changed, selection changed, and field studies showed that birds could find the moth that didn't match the background, and so that was the mechanism. Okay, Darwin had an example of this that he found. He found many species of finches on the Galapagos Island. The finches were particularly diverse, and they had beak shapes that were very unusual for finches, and habits that were far different from the finch species that were found in South America. And he suggested that it was natural selection over time, that birds that reached the island then had open niches, and so they could develop different size beaks. And so again, experiments since that time have shown that, and they've shown that beak shapes change in wet years and dry years with the availability of seeds. Okay, lastly, another mechanism or another even example of natural selection that's been thought about is even the differences in species can sometimes be explained by evolution, that organisms can change over time. And so species that are very different but have similar shapes are thought to converge because of factors in the environment, whether they climb trees, whether they hunt, whether they're predators, whether they're fast-moving in the water. And so they all kind of converge towards the same shape. So in summary, there's lots of evidence for evolution, including fossil record, these natural experiments like with the peppered moths, molecular data, and particularly this biogeography of island species. Okay, so we'll talk about speciation next and how new species form.